Welcome back to another Genshin Impact video, ladies and gentlemen. So we're back with the release of Shenhe, back to bring you guys another character overview, preview, and kind of just summary of the character's whole ability, how all their ability works, constellations, passive talents, all their talents, talent priority, best in slot weapons, best in slot characters to synergize with, best in slot artifacts, all that good stuff, bring you guys the information that I'm able to surmise just from using the character over the past few days at max level with a max level weapon. But before we get into that, make sure to like the video and also subscribe. It supports the channel and I really appreciate it. And now, on with the video. Starting off with her elemental skill, this one is a lot to unpack, seeing it's pretty much a core part of her gameplay. And essentially, she has two different functions: the press, which is a short dash forward dealing cryo damage, as well as the hold, which is a small AoE area of damage that also deals cryo damage. And the function, or the buff that you get rather, from either pressing or holding, both of them give the same thing, which is the icy quill effect. And essentially, when you deal normal, charged, plunging damage, elemental skill, or burst damage that is cryo specific, that cryo damage will be boosted by a percentage of Shenhe's current attack, and that percentage that is boosted is dictated by the level of Shenhe's elemental skill. At level 9, the damage bonus is 77.6% of her current attack. Now, the bigger thing as well to take away from her elemental skill is that it has a trigger quota. Now, this is a new function or new system that miHoYo has added with Shenhe and Yanjin, is that there is a quota to how many times this can be triggered. And Shenhe's, if you're doing her press, you have a 5-hit quota, and if you're doing her hold, you have a 7-hit quota. So that essentially means after you use her elemental skill, only that amount of hits are buffed by that percentage, which we'll talk a bit about it later, and I'll tell my opinion on it a bit later, but it's not that great. But that is essentially the whole of her elemental skill, the biggest things being the icy quill effect and how it affects only cryo damage, and the quota being 5 and 7 are the biggest things for this skill. Going on to her burst though, her burst is a lot more straightforward. Essentially, she casts down a AoE cryo damage field that does cryo damage every so often, 2 hits of cryo damage every so often, that is. And on top of that, also reduces cryo resistance as well as physical resistance. Pretty good. She's a support character, so she has resistance shredding, which is very important. But do bear in mind that the resistance shredding does go up with the level. So at level 9, she has 14% res decrease. This is also an 80 cost burst, so it is going to synergize with some characters well. Right in Shogun specifically, if you maybe go for a physical build, Shenhe, or if a physical character asks something else, it'll synergize with Raiden Shogun because the energy cost being 8. Its duration is 12 seconds with a cooldown of 20 seconds, so it's about an 8-second downtime if you obviously have a lot of energy recharge. Overall, a very solid burst, obviously not the main part of a kit, but a very impactful part nonetheless. Passive number 1 is actually a really strong passive, to be honest. An active character within the field created by Divine Maiden's Deliverance, which is her elemental burst, gains 50% cryo damage bonus. It's just a cryo damage bonus. And you guys are probably seeing a theme here, but she's a cryo-centric character. She only is really going to work extremely well with other cryo characters. But yeah, this is passive number 1, 15% cryo damage bonus, absolutely amazing. Now, passive number 2 is where she kind of evolves a bit and becomes a bit more of a universal character. And essentially, depending on if you press or hold her elemental skill, it will give you a 15% damage boost in a different area. So if you just press her elemental skill, you will get 15% damage bonus to your elemental skill and burst damage for your whole party. Whilst if you hold her elemental skill, you will get a normal, charge, and plunging attack damage bonus by 15% to the whole party. This gives her a bit more of a universal kind of buffing proficiency, but it's only 15%, so it's not going to be too crazy, but that is her second passive. And third passive is she just gains 25% more rewards when dispatched on leeway expeditions for more than 20 hours. Pretty straightforward, pretty good. Now, you may be wondering, talent priority. So this is a pretty easy one, I'd say. This is a pretty easy talent priority to kind of figure out. It's 100% her elemental skill. Her burst, whilst it does have the shredding functionality to it, even without getting it to level 9 or level 10 even, it's going to have shredding functionality, so you can still use it, whilst her elemental skill scales very high the more you use it, essentially, or the higher level it is. So I'd recommend going with her elemental skill if you're going to be leveling up a talent first, and then elemental burst, and then her auto attack if you want to use her for her auto attack. Now onto the area that I want to talk about the least, which is the constellations, mainly because I feel Shenhe has been shafted in terms of her constellation order. I feel like some of them should be first and the other ones should be later, or some of them shouldn't exist to begin with. But let's start off with constellation 1, Clarity of Heart. Spirit Summoning or Spring Spirit Summoning can be used one more time. Essentially, her elemental skill has an extra charge. This one's cool and all. The good parts about it is that you can extend your quota mid-combination. Pretty much you can double your quota for your elemental skill hits or the buff parts of it, which is cool and all. But I think this isn't worthy of being a constellation because something else could have been here. You could have, just the constellation itself could have been an increase to the quota or something along those lines. Instead of just giving you an extra charge, it could have just been a flat-out increase to the quota, which would have been a bit more appealing than an extra charge. But still, not a terrible constellation, just could have been better. On to C2. This C2 is pretty good. Her elemental burst lasts 6 seconds longer, which is actually really good because, well, it's 6 seconds. Actually, that's a lot of time, to be honest, 6 seconds. And active characters within the field themselves get cryo crit damage increased specifically by 15%. This is pushing more into the fact that she really only worked with cryo characters. If you have a Pyro main DPS, it's no point rolling for Shenhe. But if you have a Cryo Ganyu, Ayaka specifically is very good, then by all means go roll for Shenhe. She's going to be a really good addition to your team. Now, going into her C4, this is a very odd C4, but it's also a bit of a mouthful, so I'll just read it word for word and then we'll break it down. But when characters under the effect of Icy Quill applied by Shenhe trigger its damage bonus effect, Shenhe will gain a Sky Frost Mantra stack. When Shenhe uses her Spirit Summoning, she will consume all stacks of Skyfrost Mantra, increasing the damage of that Spring Spirit Summoning by 5% for each stack consumed. Max 50 stacks. Stack lasts for 60 seconds. Now, the reason this is a bit confusing is because I don't think there's any way to get 50 stacks unless you have her C6, which we'll break down in this when we get to C6. But I don't think there's any way to get 50 stacks because essentially you have a quota of 5 to 7, you have 4 characters in the field. 7 times 4 is not 50. 7 times 4 is 28. So you're never really gonna get 50 stacks, which is odd. Because essentially you do have 2 charges of this, but when you cast it the second time, you would have used up the stacks, and then you're just restacking. So it doesn't, I feel like this wasn't really thought out. Maybe this is just kind of like it's a triggering thing. I'm not exactly sure. It depends on which one triggers it. But this doesn't really make sense for it to be 50 stacks because you'll never get to 50 stacks, essentially, unless you have C6, which we'll just get into now, I guess. Which her C6 is, when characters trigger icy effects using normal and charge attacks, it does not trigger towards the quota. I feel as though this is Mihoyo trying to incentivize rolling or going to C6 when you get to C4, which is kind of toxic, kind of weird. I don't recommend going up to C4 in any way, but yeah, that is the C6. As to where you should try to get to if you're ever gonna get this character, or if you want to get certain constellation levels, which one should you get to? C2 is the most I'd recommend. C3, if you really want her to use her for a support ability, I would not recommend going to C4 unless you're just kind of wanting it. C3 is kind of like the minimum I'd go to. Now, in terms of weapons, this is not a difficult one. Obviously, the Calamity Quell is going to be her best in slot. For supporting capabilities, in terms of damage, I can't really say. It can be between Staff of Homer, Jade Primordial, and the Calamity Queller for damage, specifically main DPS Shenhe. But as a support weapon, you want the Calamity Queller, and this is due to the high base attack as well as the big attack bonus from the ability. You know, because Shenhe's elemental skill scales of attack percent so kind of not desperately, but I'm going to use the word desperately. You do want high base attack and just a high percentage in general of attack. So the Calamity Queller essentially is going to be her best in slot weapon for a lot of situations. But other good weapons are these ones up here. You just want attack percentage. You can go for other things, but attack percentage is going to give you the most universally good results. Okay, so artifacts. This one I haven't looked too deep into and tested many different artifact set combinations, but if you're trying to build her for a support, which is what I'd recommend you do, then you might actually get a lot of lucrativity from 2 set Shimenawas, 2 set Gladiators, just for that massive attack percent boost, making her elemental skill hit even harder, or buff even harder rather. 2 set Gladiators, 2 set Shimenawas might prove really good. I haven't given that one a go yet, but I'll definitely try to in the future. If you're potentially trying to build Shenhe as a main DPS, like myself, Blizzard Strayer and Shimenawas or Gladiators at the same time, could be really good just because of the cryo damage bonus, and then just 18% attack on top of that for just the bonuses. You could try to substitute the Shimenawas for Noblesse Oblige if you wanted, or you could also try Emblem of Severed Fate, for the energy recharge, seeing as she does have an 80 cost ult. But I've also heard good news about 4-set Shimena's, which I haven't tested that one yet either, but that one does sound like it would be really promising, seeing as you don't need her elemental burst. Technically, you don't need it at the start of your damage window. It does help, but you don't technically need it. So you could, without a doubt, definitely cast her skill and then go into her burst a bit later. But those are the pretty much the sets I'd recommend. Support, double 18% attack, and then for main DPS, just start off with the Blizzard Strayer Shimena's combo, and you'll be just fine in my opinion. Okay, let's talk about character synergy as kind of the final point before we get into some gameplay. She just synergizes with any character, or any cryo character more specifically, who can infuse their own attacks or deal specifically cryo damage in either a burst or in some sort of damage window. Characters that come to mind: Chongyun, he can infuse his own attacks with cryo, thus boosting them in some way through her elemental skill, and the cryo shred Shenhe provides. Ayaka has her own self cryo infusion through her dash. She would work really well, especially if you get Shenhe C6, then you have infinite quota for Ayaka. As well as Ganyu could work to an extent if you're down to just use Shenhe's shred and then elemental skill into charging up a few shots for Ganyu. That could work really well. I don't see any problem with that, but that is the extent of the synergy, and that is just due to Shenhe working only with cryo characters, and specifically obviously damage dealers, as she is a damage booster. I wouldn't recommend trying to work her into like a physical character like Eula, because the physical shred isn't too big. You could probably get a lot more value through having other characters on the team. You could obviously give it a shot. I don't have Eula on this account, but it is a 15% physical shred if you do crown the elemental skill, the elemental burst for Shenhe. I myself will be attempting to like make a Chongyun main DPS or Chongyun burst DPS comp, using Shenhe's skill to buff it, as well as the cryo shred, with like a Kazuha as well to do that stuff. I will be attempting that in the future, in future streams of Genshin Impact, but that's the extent of what I can recommend Shenhe synergizing with. And the biggest reason for that is just because her elemental skill only boosts cryo damage. Okay, so now I'm going to show you guys an example or a battle situation where I use my Shenhe as a main DPS. In this example, essentially if you're using her as a DPS support, when my Shenhe does start attacking, that's the point where you would switch to your main cryo character and deal their damage window. But for this example, it's going to be my Shenhe being the main DPS for this one. And once you're ready to do your damage window, you just obviously hit the enemy. You do need to put Chongyun's field down, apply cryo, any amount of cryo shredding, Shenhe's burst, then her hold on her skill, and then just go into attacking the enemies, and you'll be dealing cryo damage with Chongyun's burst. And that is essentially the whole thing. It is awkward doing it with Shenhe as the main DPS, just so you guys know. It is a very awkward procedure because it just doesn't feel right, mainly because you need to infuse her attacks with another character. I think it would have been cool if she had her own elemental infusion in some way, but that's probably asking a bit too much because she is a DPS support. And like I said, in that window of if you're using a different character as the main DPS, that's cryo. Essentially, when Shenhe casts her ability, you probably wouldn't be using Chongyun, by the way, but essentially you cast Shenhe's burst, followed by whichever part of the ability that you need, and then you switch to your actual cryo DPS that you use for this damage window. And that's essentially the gameplay rotation with Shenhe. It's nothing extravagant, and it's very awkward to use her as the main DPS, but we're still going to try to do it. So hope you guys found that insightful in any way. That is a nuisance to execute, by the way, so I don't recommend it. Okay, so let's do a bit of a summary here of what I think is the good parts about Shenhe and what are the bad parts about Shenhe. The great parts is that she works well with other cryo characters. You know, you can have a cryo-centric team. She does physical and cryo shredding. She has a unique quota system, which is very fun and interesting to kind of think about. But then the negative parts about her character is the quota system itself. Shenhe specifically, she has a very low quota for her elemental skill. I don't think 5 and 7 is fair enough to kind of justify a burst damage window, because I just don't think it is. It really doesn't feel that great to use it. As well as it only being a 5 and 7 hit quota depending on press and hold, but it goes onto a 10 and 15 second cooldown. That's not sufficient enough. I think the quota should be 10 and 15, 1-to-1 with the cooldown of the ability. And the other problem with her is that her constellations don't feel impactful enough, either in terms of like making her gameplay feel better, or even damage boosting. That mainly coming from C1. Obviously, you get another charge, giving you more quota, but I don't think that. I think this would have been better if there was just an increase to the quota, not an extra charge. Scented Spirit is the only DPS increase that I think is like a must have in a sense, because it also increases the duration of her burst, which is another great one. For C4, you can never utilize the full 50 stacks of it unless you have C6, and if you need C6 to make C4 work, that's just a terrible mentality. And at the same time, this should have been, if C6 is going to remove the quota for normal and charge attack, they might have just removed it for everything. It should have just removed the quota in general, because why not, really? And those are the problems that I have with the character. Quota system is just kind of not great on her, but great on Yunjin, and that's that. Obviously, you might have a different opinion. You're probably wrong. But whatever, it is what it is. That's all I'm gonna say for Shenhe. She's a great character. If you like her, get her for her looks, get her for her aesthetic. That's the reason I have her. But unless you really want to make Ayaka like hit a lot harder for her charge attacks, there's no real reason to get Shenhe because there are other characters that do it better. In terms of looks, chef's kiss. Thank you guys so much for watching. That's all I'm gonna say for this video. If you enjoyed, like and subscribe. It helps the channel a lot, and I really appreciate it. But till next time, have a great day, stay hydrated, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace out.